Okay, great.
I'll introduce you.
Yes.
One line on the CV. Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Sneha Ru. I'm a palliative physician and founder of Ori Kalankini. Ori Kalankini is an organization that's changing narratives around menstruation and sexuality in India using art, theatre, and dialogue. So the series is called Leaning into the Network, where we bring people from different parts of our network to meet each other. And today we have Tejaswi with us. Tejaswi is an independent journalist, and she's going to workshop with us around intersectional feminism. So Tejaswi, over to you. Tell us what it is and who you are.
Thank you so much for inviting me for this. I think this is the first time I'm actually talking about feminism, talking about intersectionality, because I think until last year, actually, it's a lifelong process. I'm always learning more about what these identities are and how they play a role in how we experience ourselves. But until last year, I was only absorbing. I was not talking about it. I felt like at some point, I felt like I learned and I was aware on how to read all of these identities in different situations, at different events, in different locations, among different sorts of people. And I realized that I must not talking about it as much as I know. Otherwise it's completely invisibilized, and that's a problem. So I think that's where it all began. I was like, I'm going to call out, not call out, but I'm going to talk about where I see these issues, where I see these demarcations, as and when I see them. I might be right, I might be wrong, I might not know the entire nuance of it, but I think it's the best. I think it's a good place to just start off wherever you are. So yeah, that's where it started. And I've been a journalist for about a couple of years. I've been a social researcher for about most of my career. So about 6 to 8 years, I've been a social science researcher. Um, and that has taken me to various places. I started off as a management consultant, which means that their businesses use social research. But back then, when I first started off, which was almost 9 years ago, I didn't really see businesses taken to these issues. I take into consideration these issues. For instance, when a new project site is being planned, let's say for a factory or any factory setup of any kind, I noticed that there was no understanding of the labor laws, understanding of the concerns that the people in that location put forth. It was almost always top down. And when I say top down, the top begins at an urban center. The decisions are taken at an urban center to tell the people who live in a rural area what to do with their economy. But obviously, the thing is, if humanity has existed for thousands of years, then we have figured out our own forms of economy, our own forms of labor, our own forms of existence, subsistence for thousands of years, right? So I truly believe that there needs to be better dialogue between these two decision-making authorities. But obviously, as we dig deeper, we realize why the power imbalance takes place, and that's what we will discuss in this session, and how to really read a situation for the power dynamics, the power dynamics of different identities, and that's what really intersectionality is about. And intersectional feminism just links it all to the idea of feminism, and feminism is the idea that all genders are equal, right? So yeah, people of all genders and all identities are equal, and but aren't really treated equally, and that's the basis of discussion.
Yeah, yeah. So, where are you going to help us start? How are we going to go about this?
Okay, I think we should start with the recent suicide that happened in Goa.
Yeah.
It's a difficult topic for most of us, and like you and I were also talking last night, it's an incredibly difficult topic because I recently read that it's only been 30 years since homosexuality was removed from the dictionary as a disease. Until 30 years ago, it was considered a mental health disease. So mental health has been approached in many different ways, right? And a lot of it has been condemned. The idea of mental health hasn't always been about well-being. It has been about calling some people mad and therefore separate from mainstream society, which is considered healthy. And then there is the idea that they can never recover or they need to be a certain way to be able to integrate themselves back into society, right? And both of us identify as queer, both of us identify as bisexual, right? And for both of us, we couldn't possibly imagine living 30 years ago as queer people because we would just be called mentally unstable, right? That's one. And imagine both of us also identify as women, or we have been assigned female at birth, rather. And to live with that dual identity would be much harder because as a woman, we would have to, as women, we would have to face multiple issues. For instance, until a few decades ago, women were not allowed property rights, correct? And until a few
I
decades
still
ago,
don't have. I still don't have. Like my dad is not dividing into three, so that's still a issue. So it's his will, that's different. But to know that this is how it is, even now is, yeah.
yeah, so I mean, I think legally it's guaranteed that if your, let's say your parents were to write the property to your name, you will be able to get it. But imagine 30,
Hmm.
30 40 years ago, even if they wrote it, it has no way of acquiring property, right? Which is why for women, for people who've been assigned female at birth, which is why there was the expectation that you would be taken care of by male relatives. And most commonly, it would be a person you marry, and that would have to be a husband. So there is, and the why you get married is to obviously have progeny, to reproduce and have children, and to perpetuate that kind of lineage when it comes to property ownership, right? And just imagine that you're not even being given a choice to survive on your own, right? There is no freedom to explore who you are in within yourself. You're constantly told who you are. So that's one level. At, at the level of our gender itself, we're told who we are and what we must do so as to be able to survive. A step further is the fact that we are queer,
Hmm.
right? The fact that we are probably attracted, and I don't just mean sexually, but also romantically, platonically, in whatever ways. There are myriad forms of attraction. We're also attracted to people of a different gender, right? The gender that is not the norm, so not men. And how are we able to conduct ourselves knowing that we are queer, knowing that we are attracted to people who will probably not be able to share their property with us. But that is not the only form of existence. That is not the only form of survival. We need human connection. We need emotional connection. We need intimacy. We need support. We need community. But we are not allowed any of that. So our very survival is called into question, in my opinion, by just virtue of our identity. First level being our gender assigned at birth, which is female, and then our identity, our sexuality as queer, which is considered out of the norm and therefore persecuted, therefore kept in isolation, therefore treated a certain way as undesirable. So if you just think about it, even 30 years later, our parents were born in that generation. And I'm sure even the person who killed herself, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her name in Goa.
Anjana Harish.
Sorry?
Anjana Harish.
Anjana
Oh.
Hari. Yes. So she's just 21. So I'm guessing her parents were brought up in that era where you're told that gender is so, and based on this gender, your sexuality has to be to the quote unquote opposite sex. Because the understanding is there are just two sexes and two genders. And when she questioned it, her treatment was akin to how it was 30 years ago, the norm that was 30 years ago. So as a woman, she was not allowed to explore herself and express herself authentically. So it's a lot of trauma, which is why, even in mental health, there is this idea that says there is an idea of mental health that tells you what to do and how to be and how to cope. And there is this idea of trauma-informed mental health care, which doesn't tell you, but which asks you to kind of explore yourself through your own past experiences and say, why are you behaving the way you are? What happened to you? What made you behave in this kind of knee-jerk way, in this kind of defensive way? What gave you the coping mechanisms that you survived with, that you continue to carry into today, right? So the idea of trauma and the idea of trauma happening because of certain identities is an issue, right? As it, when it comes to women, we are not allowed to even express ourselves because that's the idea of womanhood, right? Womanhood is a notion constructed by so many cultural norms. And we will go further into that today as well. But there are so many norms that have been constructed into what constitutes an ideal woman, an ideal Indian woman, for instance, right? Um,
I want
so
to add just one point. When we
yeah,
talk about mental health, there are two things. One, labeling someone as mentally ill and looking for a treatment for something which is not a disease at all, which
right,
happened in Anjana's case and keeps happening in all of our cases.
yeah,
And second thing is, it is a fact that people who identify as queer have more instances of suffering from, say, anxiety, depression, um,
right,
and more chances of committing suicide because of the marginalization that they face.
yeah.
So, so we
So
have
do
to.
you believe that the real treatment is not in just the diagnosis, not in just us seeking therapy, but a whole transformation of the systems that we work in as a society, right? It's not in isolation. It's not just we can be told how to cope with our anxiety. When we are constantly persecuted by it, by law, by the community, by our religious institutions, all of which are microcosms of of society that we have to live with, that we have to continually interact with. Because our parents, our loved ones, our friends, all of them subscribe to this community, right? Subscribe to the idea of religion, subscribe to the idea of the government, who's in power, who has violence at their kind of beck and call, who can, until a few years ago, for instance, suicide was an attempt to suicide and suicide was criminalized. So farmers, for instance, because of their identity and because of their location at the front lines of this climate crisis, they were very vulnerable. And farmer suicides could never be mitigated before they happened because any knowledge of it would mean that there is a criminal implication on them, right? So I think it's very important that we think of these identities and how they play into our role. For instance, I'll take the farmer suicide example a little further ahead. A lot of the farmer suicides that have been reported are farmers who are male, who own the piece of land. These are the people who are categorized as farmers. And if they are male and if they own that piece of land, that is one strata. I'm not minimizing their experience. I'm saying that is one level. If you dig a little deeper, then you will find a lot of farmers who are women. Because unlike our gendered workplaces today in the cities, women, men, trans people, all of them have had to work together on the farms for eons, for decades. It's not like the women who have to work on farms, that strata of the society is allowed the luxury of just sitting at home. The way a lot of people think women just sit at home. There's a lot of labor that they had to perform as a result of their location in the community. Otherwise, you've heard of, I mean, I'm sure we've all heard of women who held their babies and, worked on farms for 8 hours. So there were women who were farmers, and their deaths were not reported as farmer suicides. They were not registered as farmer suicides, right? So that is below the strata that's identified as farmers. They own the land, they are male. Women mostly don't own the land and they're female, and but they're also farmers, right? By profession, by what they do on a daily basis. And even below that, let's say these women are associated with these men by way of family or community, where they are not allowed land ownership. but their family owns the land. So they still have that kind of, how would I put it? They still have that kind of support system where the land is not directly theirs by virtue of their family. Maybe they have some claim to it. And then below that, below this entire strata, there are also farmhands, there are also bonded laborers, and even today there are bonded laborers who migrate from other cities, who migrate from other towns and villages, from other states to work on these farms, right? They are daily wage laborers. Every day that they turn up, they're allowed some money, they're given some money. And let's say because of the suicide of the farmer who owns the land itself, who's not able to afford to feed his own family, these people are a lot more vulnerable because they don't even own the land. They don't have the support of their community because they've left it behind and then moved to another place to work on this land for subsistence. And imagine their plight. How are they? And their suicides or their illnesses or any repercussions on their existence or their health, once again, was never registered as a suicide back in the day. This is about 2-3 years ago when suicide was still criminalized by the Indian legislation. So you see that because of our identity, our experiences are completely invisibilized in these data sets, right? So the only suicide that were reported are male farmers who already owned the land. They were the only people considered farmers. What about the Bahujan people who are farm hands who have traditionally not been allowed to own property and who have had to kind of be moved around as just farm help, who are daily wage laborers? They're a lot more vulnerable. So I think when we read these kind of figures, right, that's why this data does not always speak the truth because data has been defined for us, right? If you just look at the data of farmer suicides, it doesn't speak the full truth. Who are the farmers and who are the people who are dying by suicide and why are they dying by suicide? What is their gender? What is their caste? What is their community? And probably what is their sexuality? What is their what is the social stigma that has been associated with them that they feel so helpless, right? So I feel like when we talk about suicide, when we talk about mental health, we always need to dig a little deeper. We can't just diagnose a person with anxiety, diagnose a person with depression, because then we are just saying your lived experience that has not contributed to your mental health, has not contributed to the brain chemistry. It's just who you are. And I personally find that a little troublesome when it comes to my own mental health. To be told that I'm an anxious person, it's not comforting for me. I don't know. For a lot of people, the diagnosis helps, but for me, it doesn't. I don't like to be told that I'm an anxious person. I feel like I've been constantly put in situations that induce anxiety. This whole idea of coming out, for instance, like I am expected to come out and say I am now bisexual. I really hate that rite of passage. Why do I have to come out and why was it assumed that I was straight? Is it because mainstream culture, mainstream cinema, music, whatever other forms of art and entertainment predominantly show us as straight, predominantly show us as heteronormative, right? That's why now I have to say no. I don't associate with that, right? And that in itself is an anxiety inducing situation. To locate yourself as going against the grain of what is well accepted in society for a well adjusted individual, that itself is an anxiety inducing situation. And add to that the stigma brought in by religion, brought in by the state, brought in by mental health, healthcare providing institutions, right?
Yeah, wow.
So that is one level of stigma. Now, I come from a Brahmin family and I'm aware of my Savarna privilege. And so a lot of people tell me that, oh, okay, I've given up my Savarna privilege. I don't talk to my parents anymore. I think that's something we must consider. What constitutes the privilege? What constitutes the privilege is not just the legacy of owning property. You know, it's not just um, It's not just what I will probably inherit. It's also my social capital.
Yeah.
Right? It's also the people I know by virtue of my family, right? Who have traditionally been privileged because of our caste identity, right? Therefore, as a result of our caste identity, we have gotten educated, we have probably held public office as many as 3 to 4 generations ago. We have probably, women in our family have probably gained access to property rights sooner than others because others don't even have property to speak of, regardless of the gender, right? And the final level is, as a result of my privilege, I have been educated in a certain way. I don't have the burden of being a first generation schoolgoer, right? And a lot of people are like, what difference that does that make? You still have to put in the effort to study. But imagine this: I go to school and I'm given a textbook. I'm given a textbook that teaches me the English alphabets, and there are the, how many alphabets are there? 28 alphabets, 26 alphabets. So there are all the 26 alphabets, and I bring them back home. And my mother happens to know that the first alphabet is A, right? And the A for apple and the phonetics of it. B for ball. My mother already knows that. But if I were a first generation schoolgoer, I don't have the luxury of coming back home and asking my parents these doubts.
Mm.
And if you take it a little forward, I might also receive some form of, I might also be able to apprentice with my parents. If, let's say, one of my parents is an engineer, or my uncle or aunt or grandfather, someone is already an engineer, then I have that much of a head start in understanding those concepts, or in discussing the concepts at within the comfort of my home, as opposed to just discussing it in classroom.
Mm.
So when I do reach a classroom, I already know these concepts, or I'm more familiar with the jargon of it, because my father, my mother, or my family has already been talking about it for years. So there is an absorption that already happens. And let's say now, after all these years of education, I now decide to cut contact with my family for whatever reason. Let's say because I'm queer, I'm cutting contact with my family. Even then, I have the privilege of calling myself educated, right? I am still not a first generation schoolgoer. I have been educated and I have been given opportunities to educate myself, probably land my first job in some ways that first generation schoolgoers don't know how to go about. To understand where to work with a certain degree, how much salary to negotiate, how much what position I can gain, when I should get a promotion. These are all things that we all get advised by our family, friends, or social network, right? So to not have access to any of this is what is called the absolute lack of privilege. And I believe that there is nothing that I can do that will really strip me of all the privilege that I was born with, my Savarna privilege, right? So privilege cannot be nuanced to just financial privilege or social capital privilege. Privilege, in wherever it exists, that privilege is inherent, right? Like, let's say if I were a white person, I'm never going to be able to let go of that privilege.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I'm going to be forever remaining white. And even if I'm not physically white, let's say I'm a little darker, my features are still more, Nordic, more
Mm.
Caucasian, right? And those are seen as more favorable. So that's the idea of privilege that we all need to kind of consider. I feel like when I talk to people about privilege, the other day someone was telling me, I'm not privileged anymore. I don't talk to my family. And I was like, and yet here you are speaking to me in English, telling me about your experiences of living in all these different cities. The ability of calling people, certain kinds of people, your friends, just because you can speak in English, right? Just because you seem civilized to them, you're gaining access to them. Just because you have a phone, just because you know how to use basic technology, right? Because you grew up around it. So the idea of privilege is very nuanced. And I think when people talk about letting go of it, or of acknowledging your privilege, they're not asking you to let go of it, because the idea of privilege cannot be let go of.
I was just going to say the same thing. That do we need to let go, or how about leveraging privilege? Privilege.
Right.
How do you make use of your privilege? First of all, even get aware.
Yeah.
Become aware.
That you have these privileges because of your gender, because of your, if you're a straight person, because of sexuality. I feel like even monosexuals have some kind of privilege over people who are bisexual or pansexual. Because this idea that you are attracted to people of different genders apparently seems radical. It's just like, oh, you swing both ways, you swing in all directions. What does that mean? You
Yeah.
know? So,
And that, actually, all these examples you gave, like we spoke last night also, it brings in front why intersectionality becomes all the more important, because we have so many identities, and because you
some
know
identities are rewarded over others. And what if you have a cluster of identities that are prejudice, that face prejudice, right?
I came out of a WhatsApp group, which was the second time. So one was previously what happened. I came out last night of a WhatsApp group of a very leading feminist network, because they just fail to acknowledge. Like, I put up the message about petitioning for queer affirmative mental health care, and giving Anjana Suresh's video and everything like that. And I just didn't get any response at all. And I waited this morning. It was 10, it was 11, 12. And then I realized, like, how, if they're not getting this about me, and why it's important to me, forget even socially, if they're not able to see the intersections and see that, if we call ourselves feminists, we need to speak about this issue. Even otherwise, even if that is not happening, but they're not able to empathize with one person belonging to their group, and who has that particular identity, because feminism is not supposed to look at whatever reason you're giving, that okay, feminism has nothing to do with wanting queer affirmative healthcare, mental health care, for example. You might put yourself in narrow boxes, but that is the cause of many incidents like these happening, right? Nobody is standing up and saying that, look, um,
I think that's the thing about feminism. For the longest time, I didn't call myself a feminist, you know, and I don't think I was wrong, because the feminist ideas that I was introduced to just merely created the idea of two genders, and it simply said that women are oppressed, men are not. That was the idea that was perpetuated. There was no deconstruction of the idea of feminism, which is about femininity. It's not necessarily about women, it's
hmm,
about femininity. Sure, there is a layer of femininity in just our physical selves. But even beyond our physical attributes, like having certain body parts, there are other attributes of femininity which are considered less desirable than masculinity. That is one level of it. And then when you take it forward, masculinity is also hyped up so much. There is a peak masculinity that is described and that is shown as aspirational, right? For instance, the idea of a Marlboro man or the Axe effect. You know,
yeah,
if you're a man and if you like that Axe deodorant, then you should hope for women to follow you. It does not matter if you're gay. It does not matter if you are, you know, asexual. It does not matter if you're
that's a
bisexual.
different spectrum altogether. Like, we've
Yeah,
completely invisibilized.
exactly. So there is a very aspirational form of existence that has been perpetuated by the globalized media. And when I say the globalized media, obviously a lot of power for it, the media technology, everything is coming from the West, right? The so called white areas of the world. where they get access to these technology first, and then it kind of percolates downwards to post-colonial countries. But when you talk about queerness, I feel like it's not understood because the idea of feminism itself is not understood. The idea of feminism is not about women versus men. The idea of feminism is the idea of identities being oppressed because of certain identities being shown as more aspirational, right? And once you think about oppression, there is this beautiful quote that I really resonate with. It says, all oppression is connected, right? If women and genderqueer folks are feeling oppressed by masculinity and the idea of patriarchy, it is generally assumed that men are not. But feminism, and especially intersectional feminism, acknowledges that some men or some people who identify as men, or rather most men, are also facing the oppression of it. It's also anxiety inducing for someone who's assigned male at birth, to always keep aspiring for this form of masculinity that they are told they must possess simply because of their physical structure or I don't know, whatever else, right? So I think the idea of intersection feminism is in imbibing the idea of oppression being connected. All of us are oppressed or feel oppressed in different ways when certain constructs are accepted as the norm, right? And that's a social level. But obviously, there is a few other layers to it. For instance, scientific knowledge is never questioned, right? But science itself encourages you to have the spirit of scientific inquiry. So it kind of goes against, right? So when you're taught science, you're just like, when I was taught biology in 8th standard, I was just like, these are the two kinds of reproductive body parts. But obviously now I know intersex people exist. And a variety of intersex people have very different kinds of reproductive body parts. And that does not make their lived experience or their biological structure any less valid than what, gender conforming, sex conforming people are born with. And yeah, so
This
I
is
think,
also not.
yeah.
No, I mean, I just wanted to add that um, this idea of that certain body parts, like your genitals, will look like this, and you become a man or a woman automatically, also has this hidden thing from medical science about the surgeries performed on children without their consent, because they have, because they don't look like belonging to one particular gender. So that is
At birth,
because that is not spoken about. Yeah.
so that's another. And
Sorry, I cut your train of thought.
And the next level is obviously when there's science is not questioned, and science is dominated. It's a very dominant knowledge structure, right? There are, communities around science. There is a Nobel Physics Prize, Nobel Biology, Nobel Chemistry Prize, and it just recognizes these ideas, and it does not connect itself to our social existence, right? That's another thing. And a third level is political persecution. Sure, as a man, I do feel anxiety. Let's say I'm a man, I identify as a man, and I was assigned male at birth. And I feel like, yes, I am definitely treated with a lot more respect. I'm given a lot more freedom. I am also not questioned as much. I'm encouraged a lot more, right? These are certain things I might have. But I'm also discouraged from expressing my emotions. Sure, I'm not persecuted by law in the form of if I choose to be sexually promiscuous, I don't have the repercussion of getting pregnant. And if I do get pregnant, there is no question of whether I can access abortion or not. These are not questions that will come up in my mind when I'm kind of exploring myself sexually with people of different genders, right? So there are certain ways in which I benefit from my identity. I benefit from my complete something that is completely at the mercy of chance. The fact that I was born with a certain physical structure that others weren't, right? So I'm given a lot of privilege just by virtue of that. And but yes, of course, let's say I am bisexual or I am gay or I don't feel as feel to the need to behave in the same way that is seen as masculine, right? Um, all of these are of course issues for me, and therefore that's what I mean by oppression is connected. The idea of masculinity is as oppressive on the mental health of people who are men or who identify as men and who are cis men rather, as on any other gender. So then, of course, there's the idea of Dalit masculinity, and we sat through Kiruba Swami's talk last week, where she talks about Dalit masculinity and Dalit patriarchy, where at the end of the day, if you're still a man, let's say a Dalit man, you're encouraged to go out, you're encouraged to work. But as a Dalit woman, I don't know what their realities are, but we have a history of preying on the bodies of Dalit women, right? We have a history of culturally appropriating their art forms for the sake of Savarna religious institutions. For instance, Devdasi systems. For instance, who become prostitutes? Savarna women always like to tell themselves within the families, oh, we would never resort to sex work. We don't have to, right? As if that is a lesser work, right? And then who is pushed to working in these forms of um, prostitution, right? I'm not saying sex work is wrong, but when you're pushed into prostitution, it goes against your um, consent. There is no consent there. You're forced into that because you must survive, because you don't have access to property. You don't have access to property rights. You don't have access to any other ways of surviving. And traditionally, we have created a lot of political and religious institutions. And when I say we, I mean Savarna people, that have kind of preyed on the bodies and the experiences and the art forms of Dalit women. As a Savarna woman, I can recognize that. As a Savarna woman, I can recognize that people in my family probably don't have a legacy of that because at the end of the day, we are Savarna women. At the end of the day, we have that access to be taken care by the men in our family, right? At the end of the day, even 3 generations ago, my grandmother was educated. She was high school educated, and one of them even went to college. So I don't have to, and when you're educated, you don't have to rely on, the marginalized forms of work, marginalized professions, that criminalized professions, because prostitution is still seen as illegal. But then we don't necessarily create opportunities for those who are pushed into these professions to find alternatives. And also we criminalize it and we kind of make it unfavorable, even for those people who might see it as a career option.
Right. This whole shaming and this moralistic shaming of students who take up sex work. Right. So first of all, you're using people who don't take up sex work, and whenever they do something which is outside the norm, which you don't agree with, then you slut shame the person. But
Yeah.
but there are people who take up sex work who are students, and then you shame them because that's like horrible thing to do, and you won't question the institution, and you won't question the criminalization, which was colonial. Sex work being criminalized as colonial, right? We're not questioning that. Then you use it as a method to shame people. And yeah.
But even today, when you look at sex tourism, when you look at child trafficking tourism, child prostitution tourism, it's still the post colonial country. You don't know most white countries, most predominantly white countries, most European countries, they don't necessarily have this idea of, uh, where they are forced into it, where there's a racket around it, right? There is a little more leeway for choice. But when it comes to sex tourism, the idea is you go to a Costa Rica or a Mexico or, even a China or a Japan, because these are all post-colonial countries, and you know that these are exotic women, right? They're treated like that. Or you go to Thailand and then you call them lady boys. as if they don't deserve, an identity of their own, besides being called a boy or a lady, you know. So the reduction of these human beings to these tropes is something that has been, obviously, like you said, being passed down to us by a very colonialistic viewpoint. So that's one thing. And yeah, so to really recognize that a lot of this oppression, whether it's in the form of racism, whether it's in the form of casteism, whether it's in the form of religious persecution, whether it's in the form of gender, whether it's in the form of class, everything, all of these oppression is connected.
You think we should go to the next part of it?
Yeah.
Half an hour more.
Yeah, let's. So
yeah, go on.
No, please go. Let's start with some sort of a question and format, so it gives the people who are listening sort of flow.
I'm not prepared for this.
Sorry, I can't.
Okay, so Tejaswi, select now.
Yeah, I can hear you. Tell me.
So I was just saying what we are going to do next. That how you want us to start thinking, and that's why we've just selected simple tools like Google search, and how you're going to talk about the multiple identities in question within one multiple experiences rather in question when you search one general thing like say bisexuality or say women in 50s or whatever. So this is the method she's going to use, and probably you can go ahead as questions come and ask.
Right. So you're talking about the Google images that I shared. Yeah. So, like I said, a lot of these images are kind of passed down to us, right? For instance, when you Google woman, right now, I Googled it right now, and I think maybe it picks up from my location. It shows me Michelle Obama, it shows me a white woman, and it shows me a brown woman as well. What about Japanese women? What about trans women? What about Chinese women? What about Maorian women? What about women who don't look like the kind of women that they have showcased on page one, right?
Okay. Let's do one thing. Let's share screen and show them actually.
You have it? Is it on your screen?
Yeah, I can do it.
Yeah.
You can also do it. I've changed the thing.
No, it's on my phone, so I'll have to juggle between.
So what do you want me to search? Give me a topic to search.
Yeah, just Google women. Just Google women.
Okay, 1 minute. I will share screen now.
You can even Google probably ideal women.
First, let's go.
Yeah. If you go back, can you go back? If you go back, you see the definition that it shows? A woman is a female human being. To the right, a woman is a female human being.
Yeah, the word woman is usually reserved for an adult. Girl is usual term for female child or adult.
Right. None of which is true, right?
Yeah.
If we really understand cis womanhood, and if we understand that trans womanhood is also womanhood, then okay. So this is page one, and it's very different from the page one that I saw. And what do we see here? We all see women who look a certain way. They seem to be of a certain size. They seem to be of a certain identity that is exclusive of certain other identities. Certain bodies are excluded. What about, for instance, I don't see any fat women here. Are fat women? Oh, I think if you scroll a little, we are starting to see a little more inclusivity. But why is it not on page one? Right?
Yeah.
And for some reason, we see people who are identified as men. There's Brad Pitt and George Clooney on it.
Yeah.
They have mentioned on the first page, but trans women don't. Fat women don't. Women of exotic, quote unquote, exotic identities don't. Right? Yeah, let's see ideal women. Ideal women body structure apparently exists.
Oh my God, look at this. So they have measured and
If you just click ideal woman and then space,
Body
just
structure what?
search bar, space, hit space.
Done.
No, I wanted to show the ideal woman quotes, ideal woman drawing, ideal woman face, ideal woman body shape, ideal woman mean, ideal woman figure measurements. So clearly, the body structure is a very core part of identifying someone as a woman. How they look, what size, if they have breasts, what size their breasts are, right? The other day, some platform had shared something about how women with big breasts, women with big bosoms, would like to probably donate some of it to people, women with small bosoms. And it was shared as a joke. And I was like, that's body shaming. That's body shaming. That's trans exclusive. That's also kind of not addressing women's health, right? What does it mean to be a woman is kind of defined by certain things like the measurement of your breasts and things like that. So yeah, as you can see, okay, let's look up something like Indian woman. Just write Indian woman. And India is a very diverse country. I hope we all recognize.
Oh, beautiful blouse, wedding dress, homely clothes. Like these are the
These
categories.
are the suggestions, yeah. And even here, for instance, I shaved my hair in December, remember? And you don't see any women with short hair. You don't see a bald head because those are not Indian women. Indian women are people wearing saris, looking a certain way,
Yeah.
wearing jewelry. What about trans women? I don't see any trans women. And even to come across, some of the more oppressed communities of women, we have to search a little bit. I don't think it's right or front. The Indian woman is shown as dressed in opulence, right? When we look for Indian Dalit women, what are the search results?
Yeah.
This is hardly it, right? I don't know. I'm not sure what they're trying to represent when they show Dalit women here. Does it mean Dalit? If you scroll back up, this is quite sad. If you scroll back to the top, most women shown here are shown as being of a certain color, of a certain kind of economic class. Most of it, right? I see Christina at the bottom. And yeah, I see different kinds of women, but most of it seems to be showing Dalit women as poor. And that's an idea that we need to kind of wrap our head around.
This is a very interesting article. Just I wanted to point out for people who want to read. Does being a elite Dalit woman mean I'm less of a Dalit? If you want, please read that because it's a good contention for people who say, oh yeah, उनके पास तो BMW है, वो कहाँ Dalit हैं?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I mean, I think we all need to dig deeper as to the identification of a Dalit woman. Does it mean if you're a Dalit woman, you are just dark skinned and poor?
Yeah.
Or how does a Dalit woman experience life? And what about Dalit trans women? How do they experience casteism? How do they experience patriarchy? And it's clearly very different from the patriarchy experienced by a Savarna cis woman, because when a Savarna cis woman wants to talk about sexual harassment in the workplace, there are Vishaka guidelines. But Dalit women or people who are of a poorer economic class, they have access to informal labor. And Shiny Ahuja's assault on his domestic help was reported 10 years ago, but there was no Me Too movement around it. There was nobody rallying for her rights. And then obviously when we look at Dalit trans women, I think this is interesting though. Imagine we have to look for Indian Dalit trans woman to be able to see these images. These are not the images that are shown to us when we look at Indian women. These are not the images shown to us when we just Google women. These are not the images shown to us when we Google ideal women. So you realize that how these kind of the idea of Dalitness, the idea of transness plays into their identities. They're not seen as women. They're not seen as women of the same caliber or cadre as, let's say, a Michelle Obama, as, let's say, a white woman. They have these additional identities that they must constantly live with and must constantly kind of assert so as to be able to see, so as to be able to be seen as a certain way that they would like to be. They would like to just be seen as women, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But they have all of these identities that they must constantly carry with them, the burden of these identities.
Yeah. If a child has to Google or find them, it would take 4 or 5 Google searches.
Yeah,
For
and as
women
children,
there.
we don't teach children about transness. We don't teach children about Dalitness. I didn't even know what the term Dalit meant until I was well past college. I'm not kidding. I went to college. I graduated when I was 20, and I still didn't know what it means to be Dalit. Right?
And that
So
we'll never know. Like unless we are Dalit, we'll never know what it means to be a Dalit. But even the word, I guess.
no, to be able to exist, I need to know what a Dalit means. What do you mean
Yeah.
Dalit? Someone says I'm Dalit. I'm like, okay, that does not. I don't know where you locate yourself in history. I don't know where you locate yourself in life, in our community, within the city.
Mm.
So
Next.
yeah, and then let's say man. What do we get when you Google man? Just the man.
Hairstyle, beard,
There,
face, suit.
there you go. Men with all facial hair, white men predominantly. I don't. I see one black man. I see one brown man.
All are able bodies, and most of their.
Yeah, their bodies are of a certain way. I don't see fat men.
Yeah.
I don't see Chinese, Russian, or other forms of identities. I see a lot of white men. I barely see men of color.
Mm.
Right? The ratio is very skewed.
Huh?
Ideal man, yeah.
Oh,
Indian.
Ideal man. Raymond.
Yeah, ideal man. Apparently, this is the quality of an ideal man. The second picture is just shocking. The face structure is defined for you as what the ideal man's face structure would look like. And we see a lot of how men would look, how they need to be ripped. Fatness is constantly removed from the idea of ideal being, regardless of the gender. Fatherhood is defined as ideal man. Bodybuilders are seen as ideal men. None of these really show that ideal women are feminists. Ideal women do not assault. Ideal women do not engage in, men do not engage in sexual abuse. The kind of messaging we really desperately need in this world, in today's world. Indian man.
Indian man. Mm.
Once again, lots of facial hair.
Mm.
Mustache is predominant. Right? I see a mustache on everyone, except for one or two. I feel like this is the kind of cues that you're given as a child. If you're googling Indian man, you're given cues how to be a man, how to perform your manhood.
Yeah. One thing interesting is thankfully it's not filled with celebrities. I had expected Indian man would be filled with Indian celebrities.
Whereas if you remember, Indian women had a lot more aspiration quality.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So that you see again the gender bias. And then Indian Dalit man, what does it say? I think once again, when you see Indian Dalit man, what do you see? You see a lot of economic impoverishment. You see a lot of ideas of violence. You see a lot of oppression. That's what you see when you look up for Indian Dalit man. You don't see any pictures of Indian Dalit men just being people, just eating breakfast, just smiling at the camera. That's very rare. You see a lot of markers of violence instead. There's a man in the sewage manhole cleaning it. Whereas you will probably never find a, if you Google Indian Brahmin man, just Google Indian Brahmin man and let's see the difference. There you go. The stark difference. The Indian Brahmin man is seen as posing, as smiling, as standing with a certain kind of stance and posture. The Indian man is seen as educated. He's photographed. There are photographs of Indian Brahmin men existing from way long ago that we can see for Dalit men. I don't see any markers of violence. I don't see them struggling in their day jobs. That's not necessarily what seems to be the idea of an Indian man. And then if you go, what about Indian trans man?
One.
For some reason, when you Google Indian trans man, one of the images shown is man, Wikipedia. Man. That's interesting. So, but you won't see trans man in, as a search result for just man. So, in that sense, men are still claiming space of trans men here. Yeah. So,
just even the men who are trans and shown are the people who have transitioned. So as if people who are not transitioned are not trans men because they don't look like.
There are trans men who've been shown.
Who are not transitioned? Where? Yeah.
There is Nazaria's,
Right, yeah.
But you have to search for an Indian trans man. These people don't have representation when you just search for man. Why are their identities excluded? And Alok Vaid Menon, who identifies as non-binary, has been shown as Indian trans man, which is completely invisibilizing the non-binary identity itself. So I think a simple Google search really reveals, right, how we process certain visual cues about different identities. So one final search, just Google Indian farmer and let's see if they show women. Let's see if they show what they show. There you go. Every Indian farmer is apparently a man or someone who looks like a man. Whereas this is not true. If you look at the field photographs from Pari Network, only if you go further down, you see people wearing women, like farmers wearing saris. Go further down. Yeah, here, female Indian farmer. Female Indian farmer is apparently different from being an Indian farmer. And that's it. You don't really see too many people wearing saris and stuff. You see mostly cis mask people who are considered Indian farmers.
Wow.
Yeah. So now they say data never lies, but data, if it's not fully informed, it might as well be a lie.
If I type India and gay, it's going to be all Mr. India in the. Oh. But then here, see.
It's really sad that it doesn't show gay men or gay people.
And then
in normal situations. Like, why do gay people have to perform? Why do they have to hold the pride flag? Why do they have to be getting married? Why can't they just be going about their lives? Why does gayness have to be performed like this? You see gay weddings. Yeah. If you type straight people, I'm sure it doesn't show you weddings. I'm sure it doesn't show you. I'm sure straight people aren't like, yeah, just type weddings. I'm sure it doesn't show you any kind of same-sex weddings. There are no Indian weddings. I think there's one Indian wedding. What about other cultures? What about Chinese wedding? What about Maori weddings? What about tribal weddings? Apparently, they don't count as weddings to be featured in the first page. There is even a Corona wedding where they're wearing masks, but it's still a white wedding. So these are the kind of ideas that are seeded in our head. What it means to have an ideal wedding. We're told that a white wedding is the perfect kind of wedding. So maybe let's zoom back out.
Where do you want to go?
No, I'm saying,
Okay.
I think we have, yeah,
Regular.
yeah, yeah. So this is just one form of visual cues, right? We consume content and culture and entertainment on the regular in the form of books, in the form of music, in the form of movies, in the form of just culture around us. Everybody, when they show up for a wedding, what are they wearing? Right? They're expected to dress according to their gender. Things like that. We're constantly being given these cues visually, subliminally. So to think about the idea of privilege, to kind of locate ourselves in the hierarchy, in the food chain, so to speak, of social identities is critical to really understand the politics of it all, to really understand where we can leverage privilege and where we need to fight harder for our rights. And there are different ways in which we are affected. Mental health being one, political persecution being another, scientific invisibilization being a third, right? So, yeah, I think that's good enough for a free talk on this. So,
Yeah, and now how do people with privilege I'm not saying that you have all the answers, but just one or two ways how we can leverage the privilege, or like what now? Okay, I'm aware of my position in the social ladder.
we
What
are
now?
ever fully aware. If we are really aware, then we would be consciously acting on it, is what I believe. Sometimes even I lose my uh, kind of acknowledgement of privilege. Sometimes I'm just like, oh, I can't help you right now because I need to survive myself. But I don't understand, I don't realize how much harder it is for someone else to survive with an Avarna caste identity, like a Bahujan or a trans person or whatever it is, right? How much harder it might be for a person to be queer in a as a Bahujan, right? Yes, as a queer person of a Savarna identity, it is still hard for me because queerness is still not widely identified and recognized. And there was political persecution even a few years ago. But what about another level where you don't even have access to the vocabulary to say you're queer, to say that you're gay, to say that you're not straight, simply because you don't speak the language, you don't speak English, right? So that's
That's
a
a
lot to
whole
do.
different thing. Like if we look up the
The
word,
politics, language, and everything. Yeah, yeah. So
there are derogatory words.
I think to locate yourself in privilege is step one. To what to do with privilege is a much larger answer, and I don't think we can reduce it to. We can kind of not reduce it. We cannot club it with the same conversation. But I think we've done a good job of showing people how these kind of identities have to constantly. You have to keep digging deeper. They're not visible. They're not on the surface. A man does not mean a trans man, apparently, according to Google Images page one. A man does not mean a Indian man. It does not mean a trans man. It does not mean a Dalit man. It does not mean a Dalit trans man. So, yeah,
Thank you so much for your time. It was a good conversation.
thank you.
I hope people, stayed through it and they got something out of it. I'll put your email ID
Yeah.
in the description
Or
box.
you can contact me on my Instagram. I feel like I'm much more active on replying to DMs on my Instagram than emails.
All right. Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so
Thank you
much
so
for
much. Yeah,
coordinating
it
this.
was really a lot of
Take
fun
care.
for you.
Bye.